Hello, people of the internet, it's Amanda, and today's video is sort of inspired by a couple of things. One, I recently did an article for work about Bong Joon-ho movies that you should check out if you love Parasite, and I've also been seeing a couple of articles here and there talking about Korean movies that you should not miss out on, especially if you love that award-winning movie by Bong Joon-ho. For the intents and purposes of this video, I really want to expand more outside of just Korean films and really talk more about Asian films that I've personally seen that I feel like would be enjoyed by people who also loved Parasite. Now, I've talked about this in my Parasite review video, how much I love the rhythm of that film, the way it discusses topics that are very universal, but at the same time really evolves into this narrative that's just so hard to explain, but at the same time it's so easy to consume. And that's the parameters that I'm gonna be using for this particular video. Now, not all of the films that I'm gonna be mentioning are thrillers. My main focus here is really more of how the social impact of these films are like and how it's discussed in a narrative that's really so exciting, I guess, and something that would leave the audiences thinking even after the credits start rolling, similar to Parasite's own sort of like draw, given how it's been received by many audiences. So there's that. I'm also not gonna talk about films by Bong Joon-ho because I feel like Parasite itself, even if it's this new evolved version of Bong Joon-ho's writing and directing, it still is definitely a result of all the different works he's done in the past. And I've also mentioned it in my Parasite video that most of his films, you know, Mother, Snowpiercer, Memories of Murder, all of these things, like you can see that obviously a lot of people are already Googling about it now. So I'm just gonna not go there and focus more on other Asian films that, as he said, once you conquer that 1-inch subtitle, you'll definitely get to enjoy more of these films. So yeah. Moving on to my actual recommendation. So the first film on my list is actually a Bollywood film, and it's called PK. Now, this isn't a thriller. It's kind of weird that I'm suggesting this to be something that Parasite fans would enjoy. The reason why I wanted to recommend this is because it's similar to Parasite in a way that it discusses a very vital issue in such a very entertaining manner that I think it's very raw, it's very relatable, but at the same time it would give you a lot of aha moments about your own reality. I mean, Parasite, for one, really projected the idea of poor versus rich right in our faces, and even the themes that we don't really sort of like think about on a daily basis, but it really happens. It's so familiar to us. You know, it's presented in that particular film on a different type of microscope, and it's very similar to PK in a way that it discusses religion, more like different religions. Religion is something that's very sensitive. It is something that a lot of people, you know, it's something that sparks debate, which is similar to the whole dynamic of rich versus poor that was presented in Parasite. However, for PK, it doesn't really antagonize one over the other, but more of questions the idea of faith and how people sort of like fight over it. Definitely a miles away from being a thriller. It's more of like a fantasy comedy type of movie, but definitely its themes discussing like a point of view of religion from an alien, which is played by the amazing Amir Khan, whose films I absolutely love, definitely gives us a look into the ups and downs of how people view religion and how it affects relationships, and just how no matter how different we would want to peg ourselves at, given these different types of associations, we are very similar in a way as well. The way we praise, the way we profess our faith, or the way we don't. One of the films that is definitely thought-provoking, but the themes are just right in your face. It's so easy to absorb, and it's very entertaining at the same time. Now, this next recommendation doesn't need an introduction on its own, mainly because it has international reputation in its own right. I dedicated an entire video talking about the themes of this, and I'm talking about Death Note. Now, the reason why I got reminded of this is because recently the authors and the illustrator just released a new chapter, like a special chapter talking about how Death Note would be like in a modern society, and it's very brave considering that it also featured actual depictions of world leaders. But I'm not gonna dive deep into that, but rather talk more about why this is also something that people should check out just in case they haven't yet, especially if they've just had their awakening on Asian films with Parasite. Now, Death Note is a movie that already has its like cult, like pop culture cult status type of thing, mainly because of its discussions of what a person would do if given godlike powers. It talks about justice, it talks about our own morals and ethics, questions both the individual and the society's perception of justice. It definitely divides people into groups of what they consider as right versus wrong, and it's very clear on that matter. But at the same time, you could definitely sympathize with both parties. I'm talking about L and Light in the way that they perceive things. On the other hand, one person is really more into proving that no one is above the law, that if the justice system that we have now isn't doing anything, then this might be the best solution. But at the same time, this other person is talking about like no one should be playing God like this, and it questions a lot of things about humanity. It's similar to Parasite in a way that it presents two different ideas that looks very different at first, but if you try to really explore it, then you would just be so pissed at how thin the line is that really divides it. Similar to how the Parks and the Kims are, where they're rich and poor, but there's definitely a parallelism happening between them, similar to Light and L, who are very brilliant, whose ideologies are particularly the same, but then there's this margin that just separates the two of them. It definitely discusses a lot of socio-political matters, psychological. It's also a thriller in a way, but again, with that mix of like fantasy thrown into it. So for people who I feel like loved the dynamics of Parasite, the way it discusses certain themes that are very important but at the same time still very entertaining, Death Note is definitely an interesting watch. I wouldn't really recommend the new version or like the sequel 10 years later, which is Light Up the New World, but I would definitely say that sticking to the original ones, which is the Death Note 1 and 2 movie, is the way to go. Now, for my third recommendation, I wouldn't suggest this to anyone who's squeamish, but it's kind of worth noting that if you dive into this movie, it's mind-blowing in a way that these are things that actually happened in real life. Not the events of the movie, but the actions that were depicted in it. I'm talking about ML or martial law. He references an actual period in history of the Philippines that happened not so long ago under the rule of Ferdinand Marcos. The crazy thing about this is that it is sort of like a letter. I wouldn't say a love letter, but more of like a letter to the young people nowadays and Gen Z, who, because they haven't experienced it, are sort of like being patronizing of what happened in the past. And given that there are a lot of people who are still suffering the effects of martial law here in the Philippines now, like family members that have disappeared, that have suffered through police abuse during the time, have been raped, have been taken from their own homes, and these people, these elders, are still living now. It's definitely be something that mirrors how neo-Nazis are trying to push their own ideals to Jews who suffered during Hitler's time. The story revolves around a millennial who is a Marcos apologist, and he's bragging about how much, the Philippines during Marcos' time was at its peak. Like all these injustices that happened during the martial law is just not true. And so because of it, his professor gives the class an assignment to talk to someone who's actually lived through that period in history. Fast forward to him and his neighbor who has dementia and who used to be part of the military police at the time, gets mistaken for a student activist, and shit just happens from there. Now, what's crazy about this is it's a modern retelling of what happened during that time. I feel like if Parasite really thrived on its universality, ML, despite the fact that it is something that maybe I think Filipinos would appreciate more, it's definitely something that still would resonate to other people and would spark their interest as to what happened during that time, and also like apply it to whatever it is that is happening now. It's definitely something that would have you at the edge of your seat every single time. Now, like, for my last recommendation, I'm gonna go full circle. I feel like it's not fair talking about movies that you would enjoy if you love Parasite if I wouldn't inject one Korean film in this lineup. I chose Old Boy, which is a 2003 thriller film that would drive you nuts, I swear. It's intense, mainly because it doesn't really focus much on social justice or these types of things, unlike the other three that I mentioned, which is where it draws its parallelisms from Parasite, but rather, this particular film draws its similarities to Bong Joon-ho's 2019 film in a way that it delivers rhythm and twists in such a crazy ass way. Like, again, this is a type of film that doesn't really cover the dynamics of any like rich or poor or whatever. It's not a relatable film in that sense, but this is really more of a film that if you enjoyed Parasite's way of transforming from one monster to another, then this film is it. Definitely convoluted, but I feel like for me, depending on the viewer, you can also, I'm not sure if you consider this convoluted but not contrived, but I think for me, there are points where you would definitely see this as a convoluted plot where everything is just so crazy and intense. One that I would really commend this for is cinematography. Similar to Parasite, it also uses architecture as a part of the film, really depicts something about it's like the setting of the movie, or the settings of the movie is also its own character, similar to the house in Parasite, where it's also its own sort of like structure or presence in the film. um I wouldn't really want to talk more about the plot of Old Boy other than the fact that there's this man who one day just got kidnapped and got detained in this room for 15 years, sort of like an experiment of sorts, and it just blows up from there during the day that he was released. And the plot definitely evolves into its own kind of monster. It's seamless, and I would say that out of the many films that I've seen, this one is probably the one of the smartest use of Chekhov's gun that I have seen in film. If you don't know what that is, Chekhov's gun is terminology where, for example, on stage, if you put a gun in there as a prop, then that gun should be used within the the play or the stage or the film, mainly because if you put it there and it doesn't have any purpose, then it's useless. Now, for this film, it definitely put clues in the film that would be hard to catch for casual viewers, but it would make sense in like when you start watching it as a whole. Like, the conclusion definitely draws in together all these different cues that you've been fed and you don't even know it. And now, for me, I already caught on with what was the probable plot twist like, mainly because of all of the films and all of the analysis that I've been doing with movies in the past. But if you're a casual viewer and you're definitely looking for something that is twisted but still entertaining and just crazy in a way that Parasite sort of like evolves into one film to the next, this is definitely a movie for you. So to sum it up, my 4 recommendations would be PK, ML, Death Note, and Oldboy. And I feel like these are some Asian films that you would definitely enjoy if you loved Bong Joon-ho's Parasite. That said, tell me down in the comments below if you've seen these films, if you'd love to see them, and what do you think of Parasite. Now, again, as I mentioned, these aren't particularly similar to Parasite's rhythm and dynamic, but at the same time, like some aspects of it in terms of themes, in terms of cinematography, in terms of just the flow of how the ideas are put out there, and of course like the brilliance of direction is present, and that's why they made it into my list. As always, please give this video a thumbs up if you like it. If you're new to my channel and you would want to hear more from me, please hit subscribe. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll be seeing you again soon in a new video.